Prime Minister's questions. Dr. Julian Lewis.
Will my right honourable friend kindly list his engagements for today?
Mr. Speaker, the whole House will want to join me in sending our deepest sympathies to all those affected by the weekend's flooding. My right honourable friend, the Local Government Secretary, has announced the activation of the Government's emergency Bellwin scheme to provide financial support for qualifying affected areas in the north of England, and we continue to work closely with our partners to help those affected and, above all, to keep people safe. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall further such meetings later today.
To Julian Lewis.
Closed question 1, Mr. Speaker, on the Defence and Security Review.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will continue to transform the UK economy through the budget in March and the comprehensive spending review later this year. And the timing of that integrated review will be announced shortly.
To Julian Lewis.
I'm grateful for that reply, Mr. Speaker. May I urge the Prime Minister to recall what happened to the last combined security and defence review, which was done within a straitjacket of fiscal neutrality. It meant that every extra pound spent on cyber or security was a pound to be cut from the conventional armed forces. Therefore, will he try to ensure that the next attempt at a combined security and defence review will not face such a straitjacket and will be concluded before rather than after the comprehensive spending review?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I understand very well the point my right honourable friend makes, and I can assure him that the integrated review will be the deepest review of Britain's security, defence and foreign policy since the Cold War. And I can also assure him that by transforming this country's economy and by raising productivity, we will ensure that both defence and security are amply provided for.
Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I join with the Prime Minister in expressing sympathy and support to those that are victims of flooding, and thank you to the Environment Agency and all the emergency services that are doing their best to help people. Mr. Speaker, our thoughts are also with those who suffer from the coronavirus and also with the Chinese community in this country, who are, I'm sorry to say, facing increasingly alarming levels of racism within our country. And as this virus spreads, I also want to thank public health workers who are helping those affected and raising awareness about the danger of this virus. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister think that someone who came to this country at the age of 5 and was the victim of county lines grooming and compelled to carry drugs, released 5 years ago and never reoffended, deserves to be deported?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole country would agree that while I cannot comment on individual cases, it is entirely right that foreign national offenders should be deported from this country in accordance with the law.
Jeremy Corbyn.
The government has learned absolutely nothing from the Windrush scandal. This cruel and callous government is trying to mislead the British people into thinking it's solely deporting foreign nationals who are guilty of murder, rape and other very serious offences. This is clearly not the case. Take the example of a young black boy who came to the UK aged 5 and is now being deported after serving time for a drugs offence. If there was a case of a young white boy with blonde hair who later dabbled in Class A drugs and conspired with a friend to beat up a journalist, would he deport that boy? Or is it, Mr. Speaker, is it one rule for young black boys from the Caribbean and another for white boys from the United States?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think quite frankly that the right honourable gentleman demeans himself and, by the way, besmirches the reputation of the Windrush generation, who came to this country to work in our public services, to teach our children in this country, to make lives better for the people of this country. He has no right to conflate them with those foreign national offenders that we are deporting today.
Jeremy Corbyn.
The Windrush generation have been disgracefully treated by a government that deliberately created a hostile environment. And whilst the government was fighting to deport people who legally came to this country as children, the Foreign Secretary refused to tell the family of Harry Dunn the reason why the US is blocking the extradition of a woman who is alleged to have killed him. I now ask the Prime Minister straight this question. Is Anna Sokoulis being shielded from justice because she's a former CIA officer?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think the whole House will know that not only the Foreign Secretary but I, and at every level of government, we have tirelessly sought the extradition of Anna Sokoulis for justice in this country, and we will continue to do so.
Jeremy Corbyn.
It is widely reported that Anna Sokoulis is in fact a CIA operative. Now we know that the Foreign Secretary misled the Dunn family, who are being denied justice by the US government. Will the Prime Minister commit to his removal from office tomorrow in his reshuffle?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman knows very well that the Foreign Office have been told that Anna Sokoulis was notified to the UK government as a spouse with no official role. And we will continue without fear or favour to seek justice for Harry Dunn and for his family. And we will continue to seek the extradition of Anna Sokoulis from the United States.
Jeremy Corbyn.
This morning, Charlotte Charles, Harry's mum, said, "We thought we'd bridged the gap with the government, but they've not been honest with us." Mr. Speaker, this is only the latest case of our country's one-sided extradition treaty with the USA. This lopsided treaty means the US can request extradition in circumstances that Britain cannot. While the US continues to deny justice to Harry Dunn, will the Prime Minister commit today to seek an equal and balanced extradition relationship with the United States?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, to be frank, I think the honourable gentleman has a point in his characterisation of our extradition arrangements with the United States, and I do think that there are elements of that relationship that are unbalanced, and imbalanced. I certainly think that it is worth looking at, but that is totally different from the case of Harry Dunn and Anna Sokoulis, and we continue to seek the extradition of Anna Sokoulis to face justice in this country.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, it's everything to do with the relationship with the USA that Anna Sokoulis has not been extradited back to Britain, because the US refuses to do it because of this lopsided treaty. I'm glad the Prime Minister at least acknowledges that. This deep disparity with the US is about to be laid bare when the courts decide whether the WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange will be extradited to the US on charges of espionage for exposing war crimes, the murder of civilians and large-scale corruption. Will the Prime Minister agree with the parliamentary report that's going to the Council of Europe that this extradition should be opposed and the rights of journalists and whistleblowers upheld for the good of all of us?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to comment on any individual case, but it is obvious that the rights of journalists and whistleblowers should be upheld, and this government will clearly continue to do that.
Paul Hole.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My wife is a volunteer with Local Samaritans, and my right honourable friend will know what good work they do in helping keep people safe in Sedgefield and the rest of the UK online. Would my right honourable friend agree that today's announcement that we are putting Ofcom at the helm of a strong regulatory regime shows we are delivering on our commitment to make the UK the safest place in the world to be online?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising that point, and as we deliver gigabit broadband to every part of this country, including to the people of Sedgefield, Mr. Speaker, we will also ensure that the UK is the safest place to be online.
In Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In northern Syria, displaced women and their children are literally freezing to death. There are reports of babies dying due to the extreme conditions, and 45,000 people remain stranded with nowhere to go. Mr. Speaker, the Syrian war is considered to have caused the biggest wave of displacement since the Second World War. Can the Prime Minister tell the House what responsibility his government has taken for this humanitarian crisis?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that the whole House will know what I think I've said several times in this House, that the UK leads the world in supporting the crisis and supporting humanitarian relief efforts in Syria. £3.2 billion this country has committed to that cause.
Ian Blackford.
Mr. Speaker, the question was about the children that are literally freezing to death. That wasn't an answer from the Prime Minister. And of course, in 2017, as Foreign Secretary, this Prime Minister enacted a policy of accepting the Syrian dictator Assad's rule over the country. Assad has delivered death and destruction on his people, a man who has gassed his own civilians. The humanitarian situation has reached crisis point, and there are now concerns of all-out war. Is the message the Prime Minister wants to send out from this House today that this UK government is washing its hands of the Syrian people, and that he is content for Assad's regime to continue enacting these atrocities?
I really think that the right honourable gentleman needs to consult his memory better, because he will find that this country and this government has persistently called for the end of the Assad regime, and indeed has led the world in denouncing the cruelty of the Assad regime towards his own people. That has been continuously the policy of the British government.
Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister join me in supporting a new initiative that I'm launching in my constituency of Watford to train mental health first aiders across schools, workplaces and the community, across the whole constituency, to tackle loneliness and challenge mental health stigma? And perhaps, if I may I ask if he could find time in his diary to join me at the launch? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for what he's doing to champion mental health services in Watford, and we are massively increasing support for good mental health in schools. And if I can, I will do my best to come to the launch of his event.
Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After 3 years of extensive evidence gathering and research, on the 26th of March, the Youth Violence Commission will publish its final recommendations. The overwhelming verdict from victims, youth workers, community leaders and other stakeholders is that short-term solutions do not work. Violence reduction units are a welcome first step, but they need long-term funding and leadership from the top. Will the Prime Minister commit to this funding, and will he attend our report launch and to hear direct from victims and experts about how we get to grips with this crisis?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I do think that she's right that you've got to do both, and that's why we're also putting £200 million into the Youth Endowment Fund, as well as supporting violence reduction units. But we're also, Mr. Speaker, putting 20,000 police on the streets of this country and giving them the powers which that gentleman opposes to take knives off the streets with stop and search.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has made transport connectivity a main priority for this government. Would he agree with me that connecting my constituent of Southport with Preston through the Burscough Curve link would not only give my constituents greater access to the rail network, but would help us to unleash our economic potential?
Prime Minister.
Well, I congratulate my honourable friend on what he's done and to campaign for the restoration of the Burscough Curves, and it sounds to me like a great idea. And I will make sure, what he needs to do is put forward a costed business plan, and I'm sure my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, will be looking at it very carefully.
Sean Hodge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with me and 10,800 of my constituents who signed petitions that the building of a gasification plant in Washington would be terrible for the people of Sunderland due to the public health concerns, air quality, and would indeed be a blot on the landscape of Sunderland, that now is a frequent visitor to Sunderland? I'm sure he shares my concerns on this matter, and will he therefore support me and my constituents who oppose the building of this plant?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I will certainly look into the matter that she raises, and we will make sure, of course, that if there is a problem with the gasification plant that she describes, that Sunderland continues to prosper and to lead the UK economy.
Ian Levy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Blyth has the potential to become one of the most strategically important ports in the UK for the export of renewable technology as well as wind turbines. Will my right honourable friend consider visiting Blyth, where I'm sure he'll get a warm northern welcome, and see for himself the strength of Blyth to become a free port?
I think he had the answer ready.
Sorry, the answer was in the question, Mr. Speaker, and he makes an excellent point about the potential of Blyth. Though I must remind him that the allocation of free ports will be decided in an entirely fair and transparent way.
Storage.
Mr. Speaker, every day an estimated 280 shop workers will be victims of violence at work. At my local co-op, a staff member was hit with a glass bottle. Now, the co-op's a good employer and want that to stop. So they and other local retailers engaged with the government's call for evidence around violence towards shop staff. 7.5 months later, they are awaiting a response. Prime Minister, will you commit today to publish your response to the call to evidence, and will you meet with me and a group of shop workers who have experienced violence at work to hear about what happened to them?
Minister.
I certainly will make that undertaking to the honourable gentleman. I'm glad he raised it. We should not tolerate crimes of violence against shop workers or indeed anybody else. And therefore, I find it paradoxical that the leader of his party is soft on the deportation of serious violent offenders.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This year we mark the 75th anniversaries of VE Day and VJ Day. As we honour those who have served our country, can my right honourable friend outline how his new Office of Veterans Affairs is giving our veterans and, and their families the support they deserve?
Prime Minister.
I thank my honourable friend, and I can tell him that our new Office of Veterans Affairs is helping veterans to transition to new jobs, to secure a home. A discount rail card will be rolled out by Armistice Day, and veterans will get guaranteed interviews for civil service jobs, so we have more veterans bringing their talents to government.
Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. His junior Scotland Office Minister told the National Farmers Union last week that substandard food will be allowed into the UK under a US trade deal, but it will have to be labelled as such. Now, the Prime Minister has denied that in the past. So who's telling the truth, and which of them doesn't know what's coming?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I can assure the honourable lady that the UK has and will continue to have the highest standards in the world for our food.
Chris Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Greater Manchester, frontline police officers are increasingly having to resort to using a pen and paper because of the failing IOPS computer system. This is putting the police at risk and also undermining their ability to protect residents and vulnerable children. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, intervene to solve this problem?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is, I'm afraid, entirely right, and we know there are concerns about this system. That's why I've asked our right honourable friend, the Police and Crime Minister, to ask Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary for an independent review of the operation of the system, and we'll make sure that my honourable friend is kept informed.
Gareth Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Northwick Park Hospital, which serves my constituents, has not met its 4-hour A&E target since August 2014. It's been starved of capital investment, is short of ITU beds, and is expected to have close to a £100 million deficit by the end of the financial year, one of the highest in the NHS. When can the Prime Minister expect Northwick Park to receive a little government love and attention?
The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as the honourable gentleman raises an important point, but as you will know, the highest number of people ever attended A&E in this country last month, 2 million people. The demand is exceptional. I pay tribute to the work of NHS staff, and we are responding in this government, as he knows, with a record investment in the NHS, £34 billion, and we are recruiting the nurses, 50,000 more of them, that will help to deal with that crisis.
Imran Nabad Khan.
In the last week, Storm Ciara has wreaked havoc along the whole of West Yorkshire's Calder Valley, affecting the constituencies of members across the House. Would my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, seek to find time to visit my constituency, where Horbury Bridge, the place at which onward Christian soldiers were penned, has been acutely affected, and see for himself the terrible damage done to people's homes, lives and businesses? Will he tread where the saints of our communities and emergency services have trod, and continue to toil undivided towards recovery?
Prime Minister.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, I obviously pay tribute to the emergency services for what they are doing in my honourable friend's constituency and indeed in all the flood-affected areas. As he knows, we have activated the Bellwyn scheme to protect homeowners. We're putting £4 billion into flood defences, and I certainly will do what I can to take up his offer to visit his constituency and see the scene for myself.
Kirsten Oswald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The new daily allowance for the unelected and unaccountable peers being stuffed into the House of Lords by the Prime Minister is set to rise to £323. Yep. The monthly allowance for a single person over 25 on universal credit is £317.82.
Listen to the question for us.
Is that the levelling up the Prime Minister keeps talking about?
Prime Minister!
Well, actually, I hate agreeing with these people. Actually, I do find that it is odd that the House of Lords has chosen to do that, but it is a decision for them.
Holly Latham.
Instrumental in getting the ban on trade in ivory in this country. Would he be as equally decisive in getting rid of the trophies coming into this country, imported particularly of endangered animals?
Prime Minister.
Yes, I thank my honourable friend for what she's doing to campaign against illegal wildlife trading and trophy hunting, and we mean to end the import of trophies hunted elsewhere into this country.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2018, Lyubov Chernyukin, the wife of Vladimir Putin's former Deputy Finance Minister, paid £20,000 for lunch with the then Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson, who we believe is soon to be ennobled. Could the Prime Minister remind the House once more why his government is yet to publish the Intelligence and Security Committee's report into alleged Russian interference in UK politics?
Prime Minister.
Well, as I think he knows very well, the report will be published as soon as the Intelligence and Security Committee is reconvened, and I think, as I've told the House several times before, those of a conspiratorial cast of mind will be disappointed by its findings.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend the Prime Minister for the belief he has in Britain and the massive boost to investment in infrastructure around the country. But with the landing fees at £25 per passenger at Heathrow Airport, and with a third runway, those fees will rise. Heathrow Airport will become the least competitive airport on the entire planet. So can I, given the delays and the escalating costs, can I ask the Prime Minister, does he agree that it may well be time to review progress and to perhaps deploy those bulldozers elsewhere in the country?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the House of Commons voted to give an outline planning consent effectively to the third runway. I know a measure that is supported by people across this chamber, not by me, as it happens. I wait to see the outcome of the various legal processes that are currently underway to see whether the promoters of the third runway can satisfy their legal obligations under air quality and indeed noise pollution.
Bridget Phillipson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since 2015, the number of GPs working in Sunderland has fallen by 16%, much higher than the national average. After almost a decade of Tory control, our GP services are inadequate and getting worse. Who does the Prime Minister hold responsible for that?
Prime Minister.
Well, we're of course responsible, and we take full responsibility, but overall numbers are up of GPs, and we are now recruiting 6,000 more, and we're able to do that because we're running a sound economy and investing massively in our NHS across the whole country.
Robert Coates.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
As coronavirus hits the headlines every day, would the Prime Minister join me in thanking and paying tribute to the supreme professionalism of those at Public Health England and in my area at RAF Brize Norton for bringing home people who've been affected? Their work is often unremarked, but is the admiration of all of us.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable friend puts it absolutely beautifully, and I salute everybody who's involved in bringing home victims and potential victims of coronavirus, the difficulties and the risks that they face, and indeed our NHS, who I think have so far done an outstanding job in preparing and informing the country.
Thanks.
Sir Edward Davey.
When Kevin Simpson's partner of over 12 years died and his 2 children lost their mother, the family received no bereavement support payments at all. Because the parents were unmarried, the law denied that support to the 2 grieving children. Last Friday, the High Court ruled that this breached the children's human rights. So when will the government obey the rule of law and legislate to respond both to that ruling and the similar ruling by the Supreme Court in the McLaughlin case in 2018? Will there be no further delay so we can start supporting the thousands of similar children across our country who lose their mother and father every year?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman has raised this with me before, and I've undertaken to meet him on that matter. We will certainly look at the case he mentions and see what exactly our response should be, but he is right to draw attention to this injustice, and we will do what we can to remedy it.
Jacob Young.
On Thursday last week, 2 people were stabbed in Redcar in broad daylight. Another person was injured in a horrific knife crime on Saturday evening outside a busy nightclub. Figures released by the Ministry of Justice in January show that Cleveland Force area has the highest number of knife and offensive weapon offences per head of population in all of England and Wales. What additional support can my right honourable friend give to Cleveland Police to tackle this problem, and when will we start to see more police on the streets of Teesside?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for raising it, because knife crime is intolerable and its recent rise must be combated. That's why we brought in knife prevention orders, which give the police the powers where they suspect a knife crime is about to be committed to take the interventions that they need. That's why we're putting 20,000 more police on our streets with the encouragement and the political support that they need to carry out stop and search.
Dennis Ackner.
The Oxford-Cambridge so-called expressway was a 20th century road building solution to a 21st century challenge, and at the election Labour rightly pledged to scrap it. I wonder if the Prime Minister's caught up with us, and could he announce today whether that has finally been put to rest and scrapped?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must ask the honourable gentleman to wait to contain his impatience until the budget, and he will learn more about the National Infrastructure Plan.
Martin Vickers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I support the Prime Minister's decision yesterday to go ahead with HS2, though I have to tell him that there is little enthusiasm among my constituents for it, because it does nothing to improve connectivity to Cleethorpes. To build up enthusiasm amongst the people of Cleethorpes, could I urge the Prime Minister to instruct LNER to reintroduce the direct train service from Cleethorpes through to King's Cross, to make the Gainsborough Brig to Cleethorpes service, which is at present 1 day a week, into a 7-day service, to manufacture the rails at Scunthorpe, and of course to reopen Suggett's Lane level crossing.
Mr. Speaker, the voice of Cleethorpes has been heard, and he's made a vivid and compelling case. As I stood up to answer, the Chancellor whispered in my ear that we would certainly be looking at it in the infrastructure review.
Seema Malhotra.
Speaker, the prosperous future of our young people all too often depends on their family well-being and school readiness. That requires investment in early years. Does the Prime Minister regret the Conservative cuts to around 1,000 Sure Start centres, including in my constituency? And will he commit to greater funding and support
for early years development, particularly in our most deprived communities?
Prime Minister.
Well, she raises an important point. That's why we're putting record sums now into early years funding, £14 billion going into education, and it is under this government that you will see the biggest improvements. It's under this government. It's under this government that we have a robust, strong, dynamic economy, the third fastest growing in the G7, and we are able to make those investments in early years precisely because of our sensible management of the economy.
Lee Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that the PFI deal signed by the last Labour government to build hospitals like Kings Mill in Ashfield at a cost of £1 million a week is nothing short of a national scandal? And can he please ensure that this never happens again?
Prime Minister.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, it is one of the many scandals of the last Labour government that the PFI deals, from memory, the PFI deals that they did, saddled the taxpayer with £80 billion worth of debts in exchange for £12 billion worth of hospital assets. That's how Labour run government. That's how Labour run the economy. Let's not let it happen again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Prime Minister bring to an end the sickening outrage of a witch hunt against former police officers who served Ulster through the heat of the Troubles and are now going to face the most odious prosecutions for non-criminal misconduct? That wouldn't be tolerated in this part of the United Kingdom. It shouldn't be tolerated in my part of the United Kingdom.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we will make sure that we give support for all those who face unnecessary prosecution, and I'm well aware of the issue that he raises.
Point of order, Barbara Keeley.
Mr. Speaker, today the Equality and Human Rights Commission has started legal action against the Department of Health and Social Care for their failure to move 2,200 autistic people and people with learning disabilities out of inappropriate inpatient units. Separately, we have the government's response to the Learning Disabilities Mortality Review, a review that has shockingly found that people with learning disabilities are dying on average 25 years earlier than the rest of the population. It seems that improving care for people with learning disabilities and autistic people is not a priority for this government, as we've had no statement in the House on these important issues from the government so far. Mr. Speaker, have you had an indication that a minister plans to make a statement on these important issues?
Can I thank the honourable lady for giving me notice on this important matter, but I would say it's not a point of order for the Chair. It is for government departments to make statements, and I'm sure that people will have listened to what the honourable members had to say, but it is certainly not for me, but for others to come forward with a statement. Right. If not, we now go to business of the day. It's the terrorist offenders restriction there.